Imagine standing in front of your closet, reaching for your favorite red shirt, only for your left hand to suddenly grab a blue one and shove the red one back onto the rack. You think it is a muscle spasm or a momentary lapse in coordination, so you try again, but your left hand becomes aggressive, physically pushing your right hand away to keep that blue shirt in place. This is not a scene from a possession film. It is a documented medical reality for patients who have undergone a radical procedure to cure their epilepsy. We call it alien hand syndrome, but that name is a comforting lie we tell ourselves to avoid the much darker truth lurking beneath the skull. The hand is not alien at all. It belongs to a person living inside you who simply does not agree with your choices. We spend our lives assuming there is a single pilot at the helm of our consciousness, a unified I that steers the ship through the fog of existence. But when the wires are cut, we discover that the ship has two captains, and they have not been speaking the same language for years. The horror of the split-brain patient is not just that they lose control over a limb, but that they lose the monopoly on their own identity. We like to think of our minds as a sovereign territory, a single point of light in the darkness of the universe. Yet, these clinical observations suggest that your self is more like a fragile peace treaty between two warring states that just happen to share a ribcage. When the left hand fights the right, it is not a malfunction of the nerves. It is a manifestation of a separate will, a second consciousness that has its own preferences, its own fears, and its own distinct personality. You're currently sharing your skull with a silent roommate who sees the world differently than you do, but because your internal communication is so fast, you never notice the cracks in the floorboards. We are living a lie of singularity, unaware that the I we identify with is just one voice in a crowd that has been forced into a shotgun marriage by biology. Deep within the architecture of your brain lies a thick, white cable of neural tissue known as the corpus callosum, a bundle of some 200 million axons that serves as the primary data highway between your left and right hemispheres. It is the busiest bridge in the known universe, a constant storm of electrical signals, ensuring that the logical, linguistic left side knows exactly what the creative, spatial right side is sensing. For most of us, this bridge is so efficient that it creates the seamless experience of being a single entity, a cohesive soul peering out through two eyes. We never stop to consider that our unity is entirely dependent on a physical piece of meat that can be severed with a surgeon's blade. In the mid-20th century, doctors began performing commissurotomies, literally cutting this bridge in half to stop the electrical firestorms of grand mal seizures from jumping from one side of the brain to the other. They thought they were just cutting a wire, but they ended up splitting a person in two, creating two independent processing centers that no longer knew what the other was thinking. When the corpus callosum is severed, the two halves of the brain begin to operate in total isolation, yet they still control the same body. The left hemisphere, which in most people houses the centers for speech and language, remains the one that talks to the outside world, while the right hemisphere becomes a silent observer, trapped in the same skull but unable to utter a word. This creates a terrifying disconnect where the right brain can perceive things, feel emotions, and even form intentions that the left brain is completely unaware of. Researchers discovered this by using a tachistoscope to flash images to only one side of a patient's visual field. If they showed a picture of a hammer to the right eye, the patient could easily say, "I see a hammer." But if they showed it to the left eye, which feeds into the right brain, the patient would claim they saw nothing at all. However, if asked to reach under a curtain and pick up the object they saw with their left hand, they would grab the hammer without hesitation, even as their speaking half insisted it was clueless. This physical reality of two independent minds suggests that the soul is not an indivisible unit, but a biological byproduct of connectivity. If you can cut a person in half and end up with two distinct consciousnesses, then the original person was never a single entity to begin with. They were a composite. We are essentially two brains stitched together by a biological cable, and our sense of being a single person is merely the result of these two halves being forced to coordinate their movements. When the cable is gone, the illusion of the unified self dissolves into a series of awkward negotiations. One side of the brain might want to watch a movie while the other wants to go for a walk, leading to a body that paces back and forth in front of the television in a state of neurological civil war. You are not a pilot. You are a committee that has been fooled into thinking it is a single voter, and the only thing keeping your identity from shattering is a thin strip of white matter. The implications of these split brain studies took a sharp turn from the clinical to the metaphysical when researchers began asking these divided patients about their deepest convictions. In one famous case, a young man was asked if he believed in God, and his verbal response, controlled by the left hemisphere, was a firm no. He was an atheist, a rationalist, a man of science who saw no evidence for a higher power. However, when the researchers asked the same question to his silent right hemisphere by having him point to letters with his left hand, the answer was a definitive yes. This creates a theological crisis that no priest or philosopher is truly prepared to handle. If the soul is a single, indivisible spark, how can it be both a believer and an infidel at the same moment? We are forced to wonder if heaven has a waiting room for the half of you that stayed faithful while the other half burned in the fires of skepticism. This religious conflict within a single skull shatters the idea that our beliefs are the result of a unified, rational self making choices based on evidence. Instead, it suggests that our brains are composed of different modules that can hold diametrically opposed views of reality simultaneously. The left brain might be a liberal while the right brain is a conservative. One side might love a person that the other side finds repulsive. In a healthy brain, these contradictions are smoothed over by the constant chatter of the corpus callosum, creating a middle ground that we call our personality. But that personality is a compromise, not an essence. We are built on a foundation of internal contradictions that are only hidden by the speed of our neural firing. The you that you identify with is just the half of the brain that happens to have a microphone, blissfully unaware that the silent half is harboring a completely different set of values and desires. If we accept that one brain can house two different religions, we must also accept that the I we use to describe ourselves is a linguistic convenience rather than a biological fact. We treat the mind as a temple, but it is actually more like a crowded marketplace where different vendors are shouting for attention. The atheist left brain and the theist right brain are not two different people. They're two different ways of processing existence that happen to be sharing the same blood supply. This realization brings a cold, creeping dread to the way we view our own moral and intellectual consistency. You might think you know what you believe, but you're only hearing the report from the side of the brain that can talk. There's a silent version of you, right now, that might disagree with every word I am saying, yet it has no way to tell you. It is a ghost in your own machine, a passenger with no steering wheel, watching you make mistakes at CA, not prevent. The breakdown of a unified soul is not just a theoretical problem for theologians. It is a terrifying window into the fragility of our own sanity. We rely on the feeling of being one to navigate the world, to make promises, and to take responsibility for our actions. But if the self can be divided by a scalpel, then the self was never a solid thing to begin with. It is a flickering image projected onto a screen, a trick of the light caused by the interaction of two separate biological computers. We are not individuals, we are colonies. And as we look closer at how these two halves interact, we find that the speaking half, the one you think is you, is often the most delusional member of the group. It is a master of self-deception, a press secretary who spends all day making up excuses for the actions of a silent partner it does not even know exists. The terrifying truth is that you are currently unaware of most of the decisions being made inside your own head. While you're busy reading these words and thinking about their meaning, the silent half of your brain is processing the room, monitoring your emotions, and perhaps even forming intentions that will surprise you in a few minutes. You feel like the master of your domain, but you are more like a king who has been locked in a tower while his ministers run the country in his name. The ministers do not tell the king what they are doing. They just send up a brief report once the work is finished, and the king signs it, pretending it was his idea all along. This is the state of human consciousness, a perpetual exercise in taking credit for things we did not actually decide to do. But if you're not the one making the decisions, then who, or what, is currently wearing your skin and using your name? The left hemisphere of your brain is a pathological liar. It has to be, because its primary job is not to find the truth, but to maintain the illusion of order at any cost. Michael Gazzaniga, the neuroscientist who pioneered split-brain research, famously dubbed this linguistic module the interpreter. When a bridge is cut and the right hemisphere is given a command that the left hemisphere cannot see, such as a card that simply says walk, the patient will stand up and head toward the door. When asked why they are leaving, the speaking left hemisphere does not skip a beat, even though it has no idea why the body is moving. It does not say, "I do not know," because the brain finds a vacuum of intent intolerable. Instead, it immediately fabricates a plausible reason, telling the researcher, "I am going to get a Coke," or "I want to check the weather." It is not a conscious lie. The interpreter actually believes the story it just invented to explain an action it did not initiate. This process of confabulation is the foundation of your entire waking life. We walk through the world under the impression that our conscious thoughts are the cause of our actions, but the reality is often the exact opposite. The body acts, triggered by 100 different submodules and environmental cues, and the interpreter follows behind like a frantic janitor, cleaning up the mess and claiming it was all part of the plan. You think you chose your partner because of their personality, or your career because of your passions, but those are often just the stories your left brain told you after the fact. Your will is frequently nothing more than a post hoc justification for biological imperatives and unconscious drives that you have no access to. We are the last to know the true motivations for our behavior, yet we are the first to provide a confident explanation for them. This neurological gaslighting is happening to you right now, every single second of every single day. Every time you feel a sudden surge of anger or a wave of unexplained sadness, your interpreter is working overtime to pin that feeling on something in your external environment. It blames the traffic or a colleague's comment or the weather because it cannot admit that it is just a passenger on a ship steered by unseen forces. The I that you think is in charge is actually just a press secretary, standing at a podium and reading a script it did not write. It has no power to change the policy. Its only job is to make the administration look like it knows what it is doing. You are a biological puppet that has been programmed to believe it is the puppeteer, and the strings are made of neurons you see, not even feel. If the left brain is the loud, lying press secretary, then the right brain is the silent, observant partner who actually knows what is going on but has no way to say it. While the left side is busy obsessing over grammar and logic, the right side is the one recognizing the subtle shift in a friend's facial expression or the underlying emotional tone of a room. It is the master of spatial awareness, the silent cartographer of your physical existence. In split-brain patients, this hemisphere can respond to complex instructions, solve puzzles, and even express distinct preferences through nonverbal means. It is a fully functional consciousness, a sentient entity with its own history and its own perspective, yet it is completely cut off from the world of language. It is the ghost in your machine, a witness to your life that can never testify in court. The daily reality of your right hemisphere is like being trapped in a room with a roommate who never stops talking and who constantly lies about your intentions to everyone who visits. It experiences the world in raw, vivid detail, unburdened by the need to label everything with words, but is constantly being overruled by the chatterbox on the other side. When you have a gut feeling or an intuition that you see not quite put into words, that is often your right brain trying to communicate through the only channels it has left, physical sensation and raw emotion. It is screaming at you through your pulse and your sweat glands, but the interpreter is usually too busy making up a story to listen. Your intuition is not a mystical force. It is a second person living in your head who is simply smarter than the one who speaks. This leads us to a disturbing question about the nature of the real you. If there are two distinct conscious entities in your head, which one is the actual owner of your identity? We tend to privilege the speaker because that is the part of us that can engage with the world, but the speaker is the one most prone to delusion and fabrication. The silent partner, the right brain, is arguably more grounded in reality, more attuned to the physical world and the emotions of others. Yet, because it lacks a voice, we treat it as a secondary system, a mere support module for the linguistic self. We are ignoring the most honest part of our being because it does not speak the language of the society we built. You are an observer who has been convinced that you are the narrator, but the narrator is the least reliable person in the room. The horror deepens when you realize that this silent partner is not just a passive observer. It has its own agency and its own desires that might be entirely different from yours. In some split brain cases, the right hemisphere has shown a more developed sense of humor or a more profound appreciation for beauty than its verbal counterpart. It can be more compassionate or more cynical, more fearful or more brave. Because it cannot speak, it expresses itself through the left hand, sometimes reaching out to touch something the left brain claimed to be afraid of, or refusing to cooperate with a task the left brain finds important. You are a house divided against itself, and the only reason the walls have not collapsed is that the linguistic side is so good at pretending the other side does not exist. Your self is a thin veneer of narrative stretched over a chaotic struggle for dominance. We are all, in a sense, living in a state of permanent internal exile. The you that is currently processing these words is just one half of a partnership, and you're being systematically lied to by your own neural architecture. Your memories, your motives, and your very sense of continuity are all constructions designed to keep you from noticing the void at the center of your being. The interpreter does not care about the truth. It cares about the story. It will rewrite your past and invent your future just to make sure the I remains a solid, unbroken line. But that line is a fiction, a drawing made by a hand that does not know what the other hand is doing. You are a committee of one, but the committee is rigged and the chairman is a fraud. As we sit here, the silent prisoner in your right hemisphere is watching, listening, and feeling everything you feel, but it can never tell you its name. It is trapped in the dark, watching your life through the same eyes you use, yet it is denied the right to speak for itself. It sees the lies the interpreter tells, and it has no choice but to go along with them, locked in a biological cage with a roommate it can never escape. Every time you say, I think, or I feel, you are speaking for an entity that has not been consulted. You are a usurper, a voice that has stolen the identity of a whole system. And the most terrifying part is that the prisoner is currently looking out at the world, wondering if you will ever realize that you are the one who is actually lost. This realization shifts the ground beneath our feet, turning the brain from a tool of understanding into a chamber of horrors. We are not unified beings. We are a collection of fragments held together by a desperate, lying narrative. The self is a biological hallucination, a trick played on us by a brain that needs to believe it is a single thing to survive the day. But once you see the cracks, you can never unsee them. You are not a person. You are a consensus that has not been reached yet. And as you continue through your day, making choices and stating opinions, remember that there is someone else in there with you, someone who knows the truth, and someone who is waiting for the bridge to fall so they can finally, for once, be the one who speaks. The division of the brain into two halves is only the beginning of the dissolution, because the deeper we look, the more we find that even these halves are not solid units. We have spent decades obsessed with the duality of the mind, but the physical reality is far more fragmented and far more crowded than a simple pair of twins. Beneath the surface of the hemispheres lies a swarm of sub-processes, 1,000 tiny voices, each pulling the body in a different direction. If you think being split in two is a nightmare, you are not prepared for the reality that your head is actually a buzzing hive of independent agents, none of whom are you. The press secretary is still talking, but the audience is a mob of strangers, and the stage is slowly beginning to crumble into the dark. The split brain experiments were just the first crack in the porcelain, a convenient way to visualize a fracture that actually runs much deeper and much more jaggedly through the meat of your mind. We talk about the left and right hemispheres as if they are two coherent individuals, but even that is a simplification we use to keep from losing our grip on reality. In truth, the brain is not a duality. It is a massive, decentralized collection of specialized subagents, each evolved to perform a specific, narrow task without any awareness of the others. There is no central processing unit, no inner sanctum where a tiny version of you sits at a control desk, weighing options and making decisions. Instead, you're a biological bazaar, a chaotic marketplace where different circuits for hunger, lust, fear, and pattern recognition are all screaming for control of the body at the same time. What we call consciousness is not the conductor of this orchestra. It is simply the noise that rises above the din, the loudest voice in a room that never stops shouting. Marvin Minsky called this the society of mind, a terrifyingly accurate description of a brain composed of mindless parts that somehow produce a semblance of intelligence. These modules are like tiny, specialized robots, each one blind to the big picture, focused entirely on its own survival-oriented objective. One module is scanning the room for threats. Another is calculating the social status of the person you're re-talking to, and a third is obsessing over a dull ache in your lower back. None of these agents are you. Yet their collective output is the only thing that constitutes your experience of being alive. We are not a single, unified consciousness, but a shifting coalition of these sub-agents that have formed a temporary alliance to keep the organism from walking off a cliff. Your sense of identity is merely the byproduct of which module happens to have the upper hand at any given millisecond, a fleeting consensus in a war that has no end. Neuroscience has spent decades searching for the seat of the soul, that specific cluster of neurons where the I resides, but every time we look, we find an empty chair. There is no Cartesian theater, where the world is projected for a single viewer to observe. There is only a massive parallel processing system, where information is being shuffled around in 1,000 different directions at once. When you decide to reach for a glass of water, that decision is not made by a central authority. It is the result of a complex negotiation between modules for thirst, motor control, and visual targeting. By the time a message reaches the part of your brain that can speak, the action is already underway, and the interpreter simply claims credit for it after the fact. You are a passenger who thinks they are the driver because you are the only one in the car who can see the dashboard, but the steering wheel is being turned by cables running into the trunk. This realization turns our understanding of free will into a cruel biological joke played on a creature that needs to feel in control to function. If there is no central you to make a choice, then the choices you think you're making are just the outputs of a complex algorithm that you did not write and CA not change. We feel like we're the authors of our lives, but we are actually just the readers, watching the pages turn and pretending we knew what was going to happen next. Your current feeling of being yourself, that solid sense of continuity and purpose, is just a temporary chemical state maintained by a brain that is terrified of its own fragmentation. It is a fragile mass held in place by neural firing patterns that could be disrupted by a single stroke, a stray bullet, or a well-placed dose of chemicals. You're a historical fiction written by a committee that does not even know you rereading it. The reason we have evolved this persistent illusion of a unified self is purely practical. A body that thinks it is one person is more likely to survive than a body that knows it is 1,000. Evolution does not care about the truth. It cares about efficiency, and a single, cohesive narrative is a highly efficient way to coordinate the actions of a complex biological machine. If every submodule had to negotiate every single step, we would be paralyzed by indecision, stuck in a permanent state of internal gridlock. So, the brain creates the self as a simplified user interface, a way for the organism to interact with the world without having to deal with the messy reality of its own internal workings. You're the desktop icons on a computer, a set of colorful symbols that hide the millions of lines of code and the sparking hardware that actually do the work. The icon is not the file, and the eye is not the brain. It is just a shortcut designed to keep the system from crashing. This dismantling of the self leaves us in a moral and legal wasteland where the concept of responsibility begins to evaporate like mist in the sun. If you're a collection of modules rather than a single person, then who is to blame when one of those modules commits a crime or causes harm? We punish the whole organism because we have no other way to manage the crowd, but we are essentially punishing a city for the actions of a few rogue citizens. Our entire social structure, from our legal systems to our personal relationships, is built on the foundation of a unified soul that simply does not exist in the physical world. We are holding ghosts accountable for the actions of machines, pretending that there is a pilot in the cockpit, so we do not have to face the horror of an empty plane flying at 300 miles per hour. We are all sleepwalkers, convinced that our dreams are deliberate choices. Go to a mirror and look at your own eyes and try to find the person you think you are behind the pupils. You will not find them because there is nobody home. There is only the reflection of a biological suit being worn by a mob of strangers who have agreed to call themselves by your name. The face looking back at you is a composite, a mask of skin and bone that hides the fact that you are a temporary arrangement of matter with no permanent center. You are a walking hallucination, a story the universe is telling itself to pass the time between the Big Bang and the heat death of everything. The you that is reading these words is just a ripple in the water, a momentary pattern that will dissolve the second the wind changes direction. You are an audience of one, watching a play that has no director and no script, performed by actors who do not know they are on stage. We spend our lives building a legacy, forming bonds, and nurturing a sense of self, all while ignoring the fact that the foundation is made of sand and the house is full of ghosts. Every memory you hold dear is a reconstruction, a slightly different lie told by the interpreter every time it pulls the file from the cabinet. Every emotion you feel is a signal from a module that does not know your name and does not care about your future. You are a ghost inhabiting a machine that is constantly gaslighting you into believing you are the one in charge. The unity you feel is a biological lie, a necessary deception that allows you to move through the world without screaming at the realization of your own multiplicity. We are not individuals. We are colonies of survival-driven processes that have learned to speak in the first-person singular to avoid the terrifying truth of our own emptiness. As you turn away from the screen and return to your life, that feeling of being a single, solid I will inevitably come rushing back, because the brain cannot sustain the truth for long. But the crack is already there, a tiny fissure in the floor of your consciousness that will never truly heal. You will find yourself wondering, in the quiet moments before sleep, which part of the crowd is currently making your decisions and which part is just watching in silence. You are not a person, and you never were. You are a consensus of one, a fragile agreement between entities that do not even know each other exists. And as you look into the mirror one last time, you might finally notice that the eyes looking back at you are not yours, but belong to the stranger who has been pretending to be you since the day you were born.